New research is changing everything we thought we knew about choline's impact on the cow and her calf, and top scientists have a lot to say about it. They are presenting new research that supports choline as a required nutrient to optimize milk production, choline as a required nutrient to support a healthy transition, choline as a required nutrient to improve calf health and growth, and choline as a required nutrient to increase colostrum quantity. This new research is solidifying choline's role as a required nutrient for essentially every cow, regardless of health status, milk production level, or body condition score. Learn more about the science that is changing the game and the choline source that is making it happen. Reassure precision-release choline from Balchem. Visit balchem.com/scientistsay to learn more.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Lecture Series. My name is Scott Sorrell, Director of Marketing for Balchem Animal Nutrition and Health. Today, we welcome Dr. Stephen LeBlanc from the University of Guelph to discuss cow longevity and extended lactations. Dr. LeBlanc is a professor in the Department of Population Medicine at the University of Guelph and Director of Dairy at Guelph, the Center of Dairy Research and Innovation. He received his BS in Animal Science from McGill University in 1992 and his DVM in 1997 and Doctor of Vet Science in 2001 from the University of Guelph. His research focuses on dairy cow metabolic and reproductive health and management, precision technologies, and antimicrobial stewardship. With graduate students and collaborators, his work has resulted in 200 peer-reviewed papers and invited talks in 20 countries. He is a senior editor for the Journal of Dairy Science and serves as a member of the board of directors of the American Dairy Science Association. Dr. LeBlanc, welcome to the Real Science Lecture Series. The floor is now yours.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks, everybody, for being here. So pull up my slides here, and today just mentioned that I'm going to talk about a controversy that for some people might be preaching to the choir, but for others is a hot topic in the dairy industry right now. Okay, so yeah, our two questions for today will be what's long enough in terms of longevity in cow lifespan, or possibly too long, and in the second shorter piece towards the end, talk about extended lactations. So by way of a little bit of a tee up, back 20 years ago, a young professor, me, was invited to my first American Dairy Science Association Discover conference, which was on culling. And the organizers asked me to give a talk with the title that you see on the screen, Reproduction and its Impact on Cow Survival and Replacement. I learned a few things. I learned about Discover conferences, these smaller interactive meetings, met a lot of people. That was a great experience. I also learned a U.S. geography lesson that there are at least 2 Nashvilles in the United States. So when the invitation came and said, would you like to come to this conference? It's in Nashville. I thought, yeah, that sounds great. Nashville, you know, music, nightlife, and so on. And then I discovered that Nashville is also in Indiana, which at the time at least was one of the last dry counties in Indiana. So that sort of changed the face of things. But coming back to the topic, well, reproduction and its impact on cow survival. So I thought about that and did a little literature review. And this is what I came up with. Notice the heritage font, appropriate to 2004. But of course, you know, a cow, no matter how good she is or what her potential is genetically or what her past production was, if we don't get her pregnant, she becomes a beef cow, whether we like it or not. So the association of reproduction and culling looked a lot like this. However, since I work at a university and I had 45 minutes to fill, I did have some other slides, and it ended essentially with this, that at least in terms of reproduction, 20 years ago, one of the major diseases of dairy cattle was semen deficiency, which obviously is, I mean that as a joke, but the point was that a lot of dairies still struggle to really efficiently inseminate cows, and between synchronization programs and technologies like activity monitors and better nutrition and better transition cow management, that has been a real success story where things have gotten a lot better, both in terms of insemination rates and conception risks, and so ultimately pregnancy rates. So fewer cows have semen deficiency, more cows get pregnant, and fewer cows are culled because of a failure to do so. Fast forward to 2023, I guess the organizers had forgotten what they may have learned from the mistake of inviting me the first time, and showing that I had some longevity, I got invited again to give a talk, this time at a Discover conference on dairy cattle lifespan. And the title of this talk was Health Aspects of Survival of Dairy Cows, since we'd apparently kind of dealt with the reproductive side of things. So again, back to the drawing board, think about what hard science I could bring to this question. And again, the conclusion was not very complicated. But, and that'll be the subject for more of today, there's obviously nuances to it. So, disease kills, sometimes it depends. And, anybody here who works with graduate students will know that no matter what question you ask them, they can always answer, it depends. And that's usually true. But then you can learn to push back and say, well, okay, but it depends on what and how and under what conditions. And so, again, this won't be a revelation to most people, but it depends on milk and pregnancy. But we're going to delve into that a little bit. But to lay the table, I wanted to put a couple things out that are what kind of animate my interest in this question, because I think we have differences in perspectives, which is healthy, but possibly a little bit of either mixed messages or sometimes misunderstanding about what we should be striving for when we talk about cattle longevity, cattle lifespan, and that connects ultimately to not just if we want to get cows pregnant, but when we want to get them pregnant. So for example, in the upper left is a promotional graphic from the Cow Signals Training Company. And again, this is no criticism of them. They do lots of good things, but one of their taglines is 2 more lactations everywhere. In other words, that kind of is or ought to be a goal, that we ought to be able to get 2 more lactations out of presumably every cow everywhere. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the right goal. Here in Canada, our national DHI organization, Lactanet, gives out annual herd management awards based on herd records and performance in a number of categories. One of them is longevity, and that's based on what you see here, which is the proportion of the herd that's in the 3rd or greater lactation. And I'll take the time to read at least some of the words. So proportion of cows that are 3rd or greater lactation, it's a measure of good management in regards to cow comfort, herd health, productive life, and a problem-free herd. And I will challenge whether that is in fact true, or whether that is true in both directions of that logical statement. And the promise is that increased longevity allows for higher production, lower replacement costs, and perhaps more animals to sell as replacements. And again, all of those things can be true, but what I hope you go home from after this session is that that's not necessarily true. And I'll give a spoiler alert that I don't think longevity per se, as an end in itself, is what we should be pursuing. Again, there's the premise that cow longevity begins with management, and at least in one direction, that's true. If management is poor, in whatever sense, poor health, poor nutrition, poor cow comfort, etc., then we will not be in a position to optimize longevity. you get into what's might be referred to as uneconomic culling, so-called forced culling, so-called involuntary culling. But I do think it's true that if management in the broadest sense is not up to par, then optimizing longevity is almost certainly not going to be possible. However, greater longevity does not necessarily mean that you have good management going in the other direction of the logic. And just in the Journal of American Vet Medical Association last month, there was an excellent article, a call to action from Professor Paul Bartlett of Michigan State around bovine leukemia virus, leukosis in dairy cattle. And the article was about a call to action about why, as an industry, we ought to care about that and ought to do something about that. And I think that's an excellent article and piece of work. However, there's this paragraph, which is on the screen, that was in that paper. And again, this is no personal criticism or anything of that sort, but I do think it's some really important food for thought and very pertinent to today's discussion. And so, again, the key parts here is the statement or the assertion that a shortened cow lifespan is evidence of reduced animal welfare. Natural lifespan is 20 years. An economic analysis by Albert DeVries of Florida indicates that economically optimal lifespan of a dairy cow should be about 7 years, but in the US it's only 5. And then goes on to say few people would be satisfied in a society where life expectancy was only slightly past puberty. Again, I think there's a lot to unpack and discuss there in terms of parallels between cows and people. But in any case, and that this shortened lifespan of cows might, again, be reflective of poor welfare. That may be true, but I will argue here some more, if I haven't done it enough already, that longevity is not a good direct measure. It's not necessarily a measure of welfare, nor should older cows, longer lifespan in and of itself be the goal that we're looking for. So what is the goal? Well, again, if we step back for a second, there's kind of a colloquialism about breaking cows, and what that sort of flippant term means is if we don't provide the supports for cow comfort, cow welfare, cow health, with, if we have poor stalls, poor hoof care, etc., breaking a cow would mean having her need to leave the herd because she's no longer fit to stay well before her time, both in terms of her welfare and in terms of her economic optimum. And so this notion of breaking cows is bad on a whole bunch of levels, including that really does reflect poor welfare, that violates the social contract we have as the dairy industry in terms of what our consumers and citizens expect us, how they expect us to care for the cows that provide food. And even if you want it to be entirely just a very hard-nosed dollars and cents about it, having cows literally forced out of a herd well before their time in terms of economic optimization is also undesirable. So there's a whole lot of reasons why we don't want to have cows pushed out of the herd where they could have, should have stayed longer in terms of economic optimum performance for the herd, but we're unable to achieve that optimization. Again, alluded to a moment ago, this becomes a values judgment, and that's not what I'm going to wade into today. But I think when we're talking about dairy cattle, there's a social expectation that we do provide a quality of life for the cows that we work with. But what our duty towards them is in terms of the length of their life, I think is much more open to discussion. And last but not least, whenever we have inefficiency in a system, that's not going to be good for the bottom line. It's not good for welfare, but it's also not good for the resources, feed, land, and so on that go into making 100 pounds of milk. So I'm a veterinarian. My whole research program is around dairy cow health. But if I really distill it down, we have many preventable problems. And again, as an industry, we've made great strides in improving cow health and welfare and performance. But if we think about what are truly career limiting or career ending moves or circumstances for a dairy cow, as I alluded to at the beginning, not getting pregnant. A cow could have the greatest potential in the world, the greatest history in the world, but if we don't get her pregnant again, that will inevitably be the end of her career as a dairy cow before long. Similarly, low enough milk is a career-ending move, and specifically in terms of health disorders, things that we're not able to fix very well, chronic mastitis or high cell counts, and chronic lameness. There's obviously a very long list of other issues, diseases, metabolic, infectious, and so on that are important, but they're not necessarily career-ending in most cases. So these are my premises, and in fact, these will in some respects be my conclusions. First is that culling is an economic decision, is or ought to be. And so from a calculation standpoint, the time to sell a cow is not when she's 20 years old or 7 years old or 5 years old per se, but to when her net present value, her future expected profitability is less than and available, and in the last 2 years that's become a constraint, but an available replacement animal's net present value, her future expected profitability. And of course, dairies are run by people, and at least sometimes we make values or emotion-based decisions around our, children's 4-H calves and those kinds of things. Fair enough, as long as that's a conscious decision. Next premise, it is certainly true that poor cow health will reduce productive lifespan. Cows that have mastitis, lameness, displaced abomasum, these are all career limiting or threatening things. But longevity, turning it around, is not a good measure. It is a poor measure of health and welfare, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit more. And again, it's my assertion that ethics of farming cows and the expectations of consumers require quality of life for cows, that they have, some people describe it as a life worth living for as long as they're living it, but not necessarily quantity. And again, I acknowledge that some would disagree with that, but that's what I'm putting on the table for the moment. And finally, that our dairy cows are amazing animals. They're often described as metabolic athletes in terms of the remarkable metabolic feats that they do to convert forage into high quality human food. That is demanding, just like elite human athletes live demanding lives in terms of their training and nutrition and so on and so forth. But again, I would assert that dairy cows, high performance dairy cows, live demanding lives, but not distressed lives, certainly not necessarily distressed lives. Okay, so for the producers in the audience and everybody else who works with producers, we're not going to do this as a live thing, but you can just think about this for yourself. Do you have a 90-pound tank average? And I don't know, take your pick. If you're already there, do you have a 100-pound tank average? But I'm trying to identify what we might all think of as a high production, high performance herd. So do you have a 90-pound tank average? If so, good for you. If not, let's think about how to help you get towards that if that's your goal. Do you have a 90-pound tank average and also consistently less than 20% annual herd culling? And I've deliberately chosen this with the expectation that most people would say no, that, they might say no, or excuse me, yes to one, but often it would be no to both. It wouldn't be both. And so if that's true, if you don't have both of those things, is it because pushing for high production, and frankly, I don't exactly know what that means, but it's something we hear about, talked about at least sometimes, that high production is a result of pushing cows with the collateral damage of breaking cows. In other words, that we are pushing or demanding too much of our metabolic athletes, and we're moving past high performance into something that's really not sustainable. So is that, if we don't, if many herds don't have both very high production and very low culling on an annual basis, is that the reason? Or, only two choices here, there could be others, or is the reason we don't often see those two things together because, at least historically, a supply of generally genetically superior heifers creates selection pressure that's pushing on the herd. And so that pressure for production and health keeps a healthy selection pressure and turnover in the herd, such that typically herds are turning over a number that's higher than 20%. And again, so I don't forget to say it later, often there are debates about, if not what a cow's optimal or worthy lifespan should be, is there an optimal culling rate? Should it be 25%, 30%, 35%? If it's 40, is that too high? If it's 20, is that too low, etc.? And I think that the bottom line of all of that is there is no one right answer. That is not a number to target in and of itself as a herd number. And so again, if we're not convinced yet, again, for the dairy managers, dairy owners in the audience, do you have any below average cows in your herd? And the answer obviously is, of course you do. Everyone does, unless you're in, I think it's Lake Wobegon in the fiction, where all the children are above average, or perhaps some other herd where all the cows are above average. Of course you have some below average cows in your herd, and you always will. But are there cows in the herd right now that you would be better off without, that you would prefer to replace because they're below average in production, because they have lameness that, despite our best efforts of prevention therapy, they're still not walking perfectly, because they have repeated cases of mastitis or a high cell count that we're not able to manage down, because they're non-pregnant, well past the economic optimum, etc. And pretty surely just about every herd has some of these cows, and some herds might have a lot of these cows. Obviously, the plot twist in the last few years is that with the very high price for both cull cows, and in particular for beef on dairy calves, or all surplus dairy calves, that has had the unintended consequence of substantially reducing the supply of dairy replacements. And so, intentionally or otherwise, more cows are being kept in the herd longer, because that available heifer, who may well have a greater net present value than some of the cows in the herd, but if she's not available, then we can't pull the trigger on that economically optimized replacement decision. But I would just sort of underline the point that, to the extent that this is a reality that dairy industry has been living in the last couple of years, and the average age of cows is therefore creeping up in our herds because we don't have the replacements available that we might like to have, therefore longevity is greater. Does that imply that welfare has necessarily improved? Is that because we have optimized cow health? Clearly not. So zooming out, this is from a veterinary epidemiology study that was published in 1999. And this is sort of suggested as some associations among a variety of health problems that can happen in early lactation. This is all very familiar by now, and fair enough, each and all of these things are at least somewhat associated, not to say causal, but associated with the risk of not just culling, but economically not optimized culling, premature culling, in terms of what a cow's economically optimum lifespan should be. And perhaps if we're talking about, the consequences of a severe dystocia or a down cow and so forth, those things may indeed be associated with health and welfare problems. So again, this is not to say that these things are necessarily and directly causal. This is kind of an old story now, but it's worth remembering that in the 90s, understanding the associations of these things, understanding that we needed to go back at least into the close-up period to start to prevent these things, that was progress at the time. And obviously the relationship, and this is very obvious to any dairy manager, and it's only sometimes a little less obvious to people analyzing data sets, but bear with me. So if a disease was really devastating and it mostly resulted directly and truly caused death, well, that's very bad. And luckily, we don't have a lot of diseases that are in that category in dairy cattle in North America. But that's easier to understand and quantify and study and put dollars to. But reality is more complicated than that. So a disease may impair a cow's milk yield temporarily or permanently, and that may lead to a decision to cull that cow before what would have been her optimal time. It may, under those new realities, become the right and economically optimal thing to do. Similarly, disease may contribute to a cow failing to get pregnant at all or in a timely way, which ultimately is a career-ending move. But the bottom is more like the actual messier reality. These things are intertwined. So if a cow experiences one or more health conditions, that may lead to either or both of her making less milk than she could have or should have otherwise, which may lead to a choice not to rebreed her or breed her any more times because she's had her second or third case of mastitis and so on. The point being that in real life, these things are complicated. And so much as this is exactly what dairy managers deal with every day or every week as they make culling and replacement decisions, analyzing this in terms of epidemiology and economics is legitimately not easy. Okay, so I'll zoom out to an old data set that looks at setting cows up for success or otherwise. So this is some work that Jose Santos published 15 years ago. From herds in California, high-producing herds. They were on pre-sync, off-sync trials, but they kept very careful score of the cow's health in the transition period. And the thing I want to underline here is almost all of the things that can go wrong with fresh cows, tough calving, metritis, fever, mastitis, ketosis, etc., is associated with reducing pregnancy at first insemination. Well, that's not very surprising. I'll come back to some newer data on this in a minute, but the two things that I found really striking about this study, and I think are still worthy of note, if you keep careful track of both obvious problems like a tough calving and less obvious problems that you have to go looking for like endometritis or ketosis, only a bare majority, 56% of cows in these large, high production, well-managed herds made it through the transition period without at least one of these issues. So that's kind of sobering. However, even then, and this is before the days of double off-sync, pregnancy at first insemination in these cows that remained healthy through the transition period was over 50%. And so I think that gives us encouragement that we don't necessarily have to choose between high production and good fertility. We need to support health as the pillar that underlies that. And so being Canadian, of course, I wanted to put this in context. Nearly half of cows have at least one health issue. Is that a lot? Is that too many? So I put it in terms of hockey players, professional hockey players. And sure enough, 51% of professional hockey players in the NHL miss at least one game due to some kind of injury. So this analogy of our cows being metabolic athletes holds up, at least as far as that goes. I think in the interest of time, we'll skip over that. So here, this is a study that I had a small role in. It was a data set from a large transition facility in Germany. And the gist of it was looking at the association between having one or more health issues as a fresh cow and what that looked and how that was associated with survival or culling or cows remaining in the herd. So the left-hand panel of this panels are primiparous cows, so cows in their first lactation. The right-hand panels are older cows, second, third, fourth lactation, and so on. Diseases here were lumped together as any of milk fever, retained placenta, metritis, ketosis, twins, or mastitis as a fresh cow. So you won't be surprised that cows that had disease were more likely to be culled. However, one step further, so the green liner cows that had no diseases in the top panel, the red liner cows that had one or more diseases, the bottom panels break that out a little further to, in orange is a single disease, in red is more than one disease. And you can see that, an older cow that has one or more than one disease has a substantially increased risk of culling, including in early lactation. These panels just go out to 120 days. And generally speaking, culling a cow at that stage of lactation would not be economically optimal as a starting point. The other thing is that you see there's differences between the first calvers and the older cows. And again, age generally is protective. Other things being equal, a 2-year-old is more likely to be retained in the herd, and she remains more likely to be retained in the herd, even if she has experienced one health condition as a fresh cow or even more than one condition as a fresh cow. The question is, and this study doesn't answer it, is that biology? Are those 2-year-olds actually more resilient? Do they truly recover better, both in terms of recovering production and perhaps fertility? Is that biology? Is that economics? That typically these animals have a greater future expected lifespan, so that comes into the decision and calculation, or is it even a little bit more, let's go from biology to economics to psychology? It's the expectation or even the wish that they should have more life in front of them, give them more chances. And again, that may or may not be the economically optimal thing to do. Jump ahead to one of my own data sets. So this was again published almost 15 years ago. Decent sized data set, over 2,000 cows in both Western New York and Ontario. What's good about this study is that we had very robust, proactively collected, quite comprehensive clinical and metabolic health data. The missing piece, which is important, is that we didn't have lameness scores on these cows. So what I want to show you here on the left-hand panel is risk of culling by 9 weeks in lactation, 63 days in milk. And on the right-hand panel is full lactation culling by 300 days in milk. And across the bottom in both cases are a variety of health disorders: dystocia, twins, retained placenta, metritis, DA, mastitis, ketosis, reproductive tract infection, and inflammation. And most of those conditions, so the orange bars are the cows that had those problems and their culling risks. The blue bars are the cows that didn't. And for almost all of those health conditions of fresh cows, they were associated with increased risk of culling by 9 weeks in lactation. If we followed cows out for the whole lactation, obviously the total culling goes up, but now things shift a little bit. So as that's farther into the rear view mirror, having had a tough calving twins retained placenta metritis is not associated with 300-day culling risk anymore. Different things are, DAs are, mastitis is, etc. Again, the thing though is this is just looking at health and culling. If we add in milk, because, ask any dairy manager, dairy owner, do you want healthy cows? Yes, absolutely. And I want milk and I want fertility. These are not hopefully things you have to choose between. So the point is, when we come and look at the data and try to understand the data better, I've got two models here. Again, the same setup. On the left is risk of culling by 9 weeks in milk. On the right is culling by end of a full lactation, 300 days. And the point I want to make here simply is that when we take the same data, but now add in production, so in terms of early lactation culling risk, we're adding in what was their milk at their first DHI test. When we're looking at the whole lactation, we're looking at what was their milk, projected 305 milk in this case at their third test day, which is a pretty accurate projection of what they're going to do for their whole 305. And again, this will not surprise anyone, but the more milk cows made as a fresh cow or beyond that was very protective. So many of the health variables that by themselves were associated with culling risk fall away when you also control for milk. So if cows are high producers, if they recover well, that's protective against culling. Duh. But the point is that it's not uncommon for studies to be published and presentations to be made that look at these things in isolation. What's the association of health? What's the association of milk? Or back to my cheesy example at the very outset, what's the association of pregnancy? Get pregnant or leave the herd. So the point is, again, this is what dairy managers do every day, but it's not always what gets published and presented at meetings. Here are two more examples quickly, and then we'll turn a corner. So this is a data set published from Germany, a huge database, 29,000 lactations from half as many cows, so repeated over time, from two farms in Germany and Slovakia, 5 years worth of data. And they looked at a lot of things, but the thing I'm showing here is the association between days in the close-up group and probability of culling by 300 days in milk. And so the headline, or the two headlines were, time in the close-up period is really important. It's associated with a whole bunch of things, but in this case, culling risk. And there's sort of a curvilinear or quadratic type of relationship here, whereby cows that spend around 3 weeks in the close-up had a greater survival to 300 days. And if they had a really short close-up period or a long close-up period, that was associated with lower probability of being around for 300 days. So the headline was that was the most associated thing. And if you go one step down, well, they had data on a whole bunch of health disorders, but none of those per se were associated. But again, it depends. It depends how you look at the data. And this is not to say it's wrong. It's just on the contrary, but rather that it's important to look past the headline. So in this case, predictably, days in the close-up is partially a planned management decision, but it also gets affected by a whole bunch of other things. And days in the close-up period is in turn associated with how much milk the cows made, risk of milk fever, retained placenta, ketosis, DA, and so on. So it doesn't negate that any or all of those things are in their own right associated with culling risk, but it's what epidemiologists refer to as a suitcase variable. A whole bunch of things get put in there together. One more, still Germany. This is a very large data set of cows that were on double off sync, so kind of our most interventionist, state-of-the-art timed AI synchronization program for first service. So got 15,000 cows on double ovsing for first service, and looking at how their experience as a fresh cow, specifically whether they were healthy, had retained placenta, metritis, mastitis, ketosis, what that did to their pregnancy at first AI. And essentially, it pulled it down by 10 to 15 percentage points. So basically all the cows got AI'd for the first service at about the same time on the same program, but having lived through those experiences as a fresh cow, even when they're on the Cadillac synchronization program, still there's a penalty to be paid for what their experience was as a fresh cow. And the reason why that has such a long hangover is probably manyfold, but one part of that is probably explained by what's known as the Britt hypothesis. So here we'll get off the soapbox and into the physiology for just a minute. So Jack Britt is a very famous reproductive physiologist. He's still very active as a dairy scientist. And very briefly, he was working from the observation that he and others made that there seemed to be variability in the probability of success to first insemination depending on when it occurred. And to make a very long story short, the hypothesis went that most cows, if not all cows, go into negative energy balance in early lactation to support making a peak of milk. That's a good thing to a point, but also understanding that ovarian follicles, the oocyte inside them, the oocyte has been with the cow since before she was born. The follicle comes out of dormancy and starts to develop over at least 2 months and possibly a bit longer than that. It's hard to study, but the picture that you see here from one of Britt's original papers was a schematic explanation that follicle that a cow might be ovulating and we're trying to get her pregnant to at first or second service began to develop and was growing up and probably affected by the metabolic and local endocrine environment as it came out of dormancy and began to grow over that at least 2-month period. And that as cows went through that negative energy balance, that would have directly or indirectly some consequences on the quality of that follicle and that oocyte. And that hypothesis helps to explain how and why a cow that had a metabolic disorder or disease experience as a fresh cow, even though that problem seems to be completely resolved, cows don't still have a retained placenta or metritis when they're 60, 70, 80, 90 days in milk, but the fact of having lived through it, at least in terms of their ovaries, has a long-term hangover. And we could layer on top of this, and this is tongue firmly in cheek, I'm not taking credit for this, but we could layer on top of that we now understand better that cows, in addition to the potential consequences of negative energy balance or possibly excessive negative energy balance, they also go through postpartum inflammation. And again, some is good. Possibly they could have not enough, but too much, too great an amplitude, too great a duration of postpartum inflammation plausibly may also have effects on both ovaries and the uterus. And so Tony Brinjay, who's my former PhD student, who's now a professor at South Dakota State, one of his big PhD studies was in 2 herds here in Ontario, milking about 450 cows each, and very intensively following these cows through the transition period, looking, among other things, at whether they expressed estrus as detected by an activity monitor, and ultimately whether they got pregnant and stayed pregnant. Again, there's a great deal here, but for today, I just want to mention, remember back to that study I showed you from Jose Santos from 15 years ago when I said that barely half of cows make it through the transition period without at least one health disorder or risk factor. Exactly the same thing here. Collectively, 49% of our cows in these high production, high pregnancy rate herds had at least one clinical disease. So that's not just a historical artifact. And again, you'll be getting used to this by now. Now we're looking at the outcome being did a cow spontaneously show estrus as detected by an automated activity monitor between 50 and 75 days in milk? And again, healthy cows, it's close to 80%, 75, 80% of those cows do. Cows that experience retained placenta, hyperketonemia, endometritis, uterine infection at a month postpartum, losing more than half a point of body score, that pulls that number down to 65 or even 60%. Heat is good, pregnancy is better, and again, going through the hopper, the filter of all those risk factors in the fresh period, cows that had pus discharge, purulent vaginal discharge, PVD, at 5 weeks postpartum, that was associated with, and probably at least indirectly contributed to, a 10 percentage point difference reduction in pregnancy at first insemination. Cows that also had, or that otherwise had, excessive inflammation as measured by haptoglobin, which is a acute phase protein marker of inflammation in early lactation, also had a 10 percentage point reduction in their pregnancy at first AI. And these things are the gift that keeps on giving. So this is also from a different paper from Tony's PhD, zooming out or zooming forward to not only getting pregnant. So again, here we've lumped together uterine disease being retained placenta, metritis, pus discharge, or actual endometritis measured by cytology. But using gene expression tests for very early pregnancy diagnosis through PAG blood tests and an ultrasound confirmation. But again, no surprise, healthy cows have pregnancy losses, but cows that have experienced uterine disease, even though they apparently got over it, have substantially greater pregnancy losses. So less likely to show heat, less likely to get pregnant in the first place, more likely to lose that first pregnancy despite having gotten through the first two hurdles. So oversimplifying, but hopefully usefully for the point of discussion, we've got a number of preventable and more or less fixable problems for our cows, including things like metritis, early stage lameness, at least some cases of mastitis. But we also have some problems that, despite our best efforts so far, we're not very able to fix or even prevent, like chronic recurrent mastitis, certain pathogens, chronic lameness, Johne's disease, leukosis, and so on. So to conclude here, and then I've just got a couple more slides to finish the thought. Some of this, as I said, will be preaching to the choir and obvious to people who make culling decisions for dairy cows every week. However, there's still a job to be done to have enough of those large enough data sets that have all of comprehensive, credible health data and production and fertility for us to really do better at identifying which of those things are most influential and do the economics well. Culling and longevity are ultimately economic decisions. We're right now in a place where, on the one hand, we've got very high prices for cull cows and replacement animals, but a lack of replacement animals. And the importance of disease, any disease, is what proportion of cows are affected and what's the impact per case, not just what's the impact per case. Okay, final couple thoughts here, and then we'll wrap it up and take some questions. This is not the same question as what we started with, but I think it's related. And so if we think about, all right, I've got this cow, she's earned a place in my heart, if not my spreadsheet, to say I do want her in the herd. I wish to get her pregnant. Obviously, if that's a failure, that is going to impinge on economically optimal culling, and that's where the dollars come from. So there's an economically optimal time for cows to get pregnant that has a lot of variables that go into it, but one of the big drivers is the shape of cows' lactation curves. And so generally, the economic meter starts running somewhere past about 120 to 120 days in milk, where we're beginning to incur and accrue opportunity costs for cows, assuming they get pregnant, but they get pregnant later than would be economically optimal. And then obviously, if we fail to get them pregnant, that's another loss. The part that is less obvious for many people is the full list and also the relative importance of those costs. So if I breed a cow today and she doesn't get pregnant, I have a cost that wasted, if you want, in air quotes, dose of semen, and I'm going to have to buy another one. There's labor, there's money for shots, there's that cow's contribution to amortizing the activity monitors or whatever. There's paying the vet to tell you the bad news that the cow is open. Ultimately, there's the culling that we've talked about. Historically, the cash value of the calf on the ground was small, but now it's large. But ultimately, the really big number, even bigger number, is that future milk profit. And again, that it depends on milk price and a whole mess of other things. Literally, you can get a PhD in economics trying to figure this stuff out and model it. But the key thing is the obvious things like needing another dose of semen or another go round of synchronization. That's the pennies and nickels, the dollars and big dollars are particularly the future milk check. And again, that's a function of cows' lactation curves. And the gist of this whole exercise is optimizing how much of a cow's life she spends closest to the most profitable part of her lactation curve, which generally speaking is close to peak, because the lines between cost, feed simply, and revenue, milk simplistically, are not parallel. And so again, where does the money come from? From marginal milk, having cows spend more of their life, or perhaps more specifically, having more of the slots on a dairy, spaces in the parlor, spaces in the barn, being filled by cows that are closer to their economic optimum. They spend more of their life close to that economic sweet spot, which is close to peak, as opposed to farther away from peak. Currently, there's a lot of value in the calves that they produce, especially dairy beef calves, but replacements as well. And driving up preg rates drives that. Again, this could be a whole other talk, so don't worry, it's not going to be. But my point is that at least so far, and again, there are caveats on this, but at least so far, the economic models have not fundamentally changed or found a conclusion different than the one driven by the shape of cows' lactation curves. And yes, over the years, peaks have gotten higher. And yes, over the years, persistency, at least in some cases, has gotten better. But so far, those models have not broken the mold that we would like cows, even very high producing cows, to be back in calf again by around 120-25 days in milk. It is difficult to run controlled studies on this. So there was one done in New York from Julio Giordano's research group several years ago, published by Matthias Stangeferro, where they looked at actually prospectively in a randomized controlled trial assigning animals to double off sync at either 60 or 88 days in milk. The bottom line of that was that economically, there was not a lot of daylight between those two options. Perhaps a small advantage over a moderate time horizon for the later first insemination and first calvers, and the opposite for the older cows, but not a lot of economic daylight between the two. The thing I want to finish with here is there's now been a couple of studies done in Sweden and in the Netherlands that have also prospectively put animals onto extended lactation. So things like breeding cows at 80 or for the first time, not till 120 days in milk, or in some cases even later than that, 150 plus. And kudos for getting those studies done, but I think the point of discussion or the critique is one of the main outcomes in those studies is often looking at what's the success of that insemination if that first insemination is at 80 days, 120 days, 150 days in milk. And much as that's a good question, I think it's really missing the bigger picture, because that is not the most limiting thing. We're not trying to drive this around driving conception per AI or even milk per cow per year. It should probably be on a longer horizon than that. And in fact, really trying to decide the optimum about this will be a bit of an it depends, where it should be profit, not conception risk or something like that, but profit per most limiting resource. So where I am in Canada, that's going to be per kilogram of butterfat that you can sell, which is milking quota. For most other dairies in the United States, that's going to be per slot, which is space in the barn. So whether you stock at 100% or 110% or whatever number looks to economically optimize the spaces in your dairy, available parlor capacity, available robot capacity. In other contexts, that may look like per hectare, per acre, per ton of nitrogen or phosphorus for your land base. In the future, that might look like per ton of greenhouse gases that the farm emits. So to wrap up, culling is an economic decision. Ideally, we want to sell cows when her net present value is less than a replacement, which is hopefully available. If we don't do well with managing health and cow comfort, then we will not be able to make economically optimal decisions about when to replace cows, and we will not optimize cows' longevity. However, longevity per se is a poor measure of welfare or the success of management, because there are too many other things that influence that. And again, the transition period certainly can be a pitfall, and it is a high-risk time, but it's something to be managed, not something to be proactively avoided, because it leads to another future peak and another time in that economically optimum part of the cow's profit curve. And so, yes, poor health will reduce productive lifespan, but we should not seek to have herds of older cows as proof of good health and welfare, because, for example, the fact that we're constrained in the supply of replacements right now, and that longevity for that reason is creeping up, does not mean that we have improved welfare necessarily, and that is causally resulting in cows having longer lives in dairy herds. And at least up until now, there hasn't been a lactation curve, a peak, a persistency, and so on that has fundamentally changed the economic goal that we would like cows back in calf again about 4 months after their last calving, so such that they're calving approximately every 13 months. And with that, I will stop. Thank you for your time, and happy to take a few questions, Scott.
The heat of summer is coming, and it can have a big impact on your cows. NiaSure Precision Release Niacin is the perfect complement to traditional heat abatement strategies to help keep her cool from the inside. Using Balchem's proprietary encapsulation process, NiaSure delivers 8 times more bioavailability than raw niacin, leading to an increase in sweating and vasodilation to reduce internal body temperature and support maximum productivity. Learn more at balchemanh.com/cool and keep her cool from the inside.
As a reminder to our audience, you can still submit questions through the Q&A tab at the top of your screen. So, Stephen, your first question is going to come in from Anika. Actually, she's got a couple. She'd like you to explain PVD. And then she says, days in close up, was it an individual level or herd level? And if individual level, could a short period be with an included short pregnancy or perhaps dead calf per se causing culling? Or a long period on individual basis could be caused by false insemination data or thus a longer non-positive period in close-up conditions.
So let me do those in reverse order and
Yep.
briefly, yes, all of the above. So that study from Germany did look at individual cow data, and absolutely, and I think that's one of the points that I didn't dwell on. But yeah, that's you wouldn't plan for a 7 days in the close-up period. That's probably because the cow calved early for whatever reason, but none of them are desirable. So yes to all of those things. And again, that is expressly not to imply that that there's causes there, that it's the short dry period that caused that. It's the cat, the cat, whatever, she had twins, she had a late abortion, she had whatever she had. But that's how that happened. And then on the PVD side, that's PVD is what was and sometimes still is called clinical endometritis. So we're talking about pus that you find in the cranial vagina of the cow with a vaginoscope or a scoop called a metrocheck or a clean gloved hand. That pus may in fact come from the uterus or it may come from the cervix, but either way, it's a reflection of ongoing chronic smoldering active bacterial infection in the cow's reproductive tract, which unsurprisingly is no good for her fertility.
All right, very well. Next question is from Dr. Greenfield. As we now construct our repro programs to produce a desired number of replacements using sexed and beef semen, do we have the model telling us how many first lactation animals to keep in our herd to maximize or to optimize milk production, keep more mature cows yet productive animals in the herd, but also genetic progress? So how do you balance all of that?
So yeah, that is sort of the, I don't know, $1 million+ question. So on the one hand, the ivory tower answer is it depends, it's complicated, etc. But practically, yes, there are some tools. And again, they're tools. They're not prescriptions about exactly what to do with each cow or exactly what to target for a herd. However, there are some tools. For example, one small but helpful tool just in terms of food for thought is within Dairy Comp, there's a module called Cow Value. It does some estimations based on numbers you put in and based on the dairy's own data that will give you some useful starting points and food for thought around cow value, which is exactly its goal is exactly to be how much more is each cow worth relative to the average replacement heifer coming into your herd given the expected lifespans of those animals. And it also calculates something called pregnancy value, which says how much does that number change if a cow's pregnancy changes, so pregnancy status changes. So if I got an open cow, would she be worth enough that it's worth breeding her again? Again, this is not handed down on stone tablets from some higher power. It's food for thought. Another one that's very accessible, Victor Cabrera has done a number of models which are available on his Wisconsin Dairy Management website, which looks at each of those questions. So lets you at least play with looking at that economically optimized replacement and helps you do some calculations, some estimations around optimizing that mix of what proportion of my animals do I want to breed to beef? What proportion do I want to breed for replacements? How many replacements do I need, etc. So those are two widely accessible tools that can certainly make some headway in helping to go from abstract ideas to some actual numbers.
All right, thank you. Mario is asking your comments on twinning percent increasing in more mature herds, over 55% on third lactation. Is there any effect on reducing twinning using choline to transition cows and open cows. If you don't know that one, maybe we can bring in Clay.
I was going to say that so I am not aware of any data that looks at a choline effect on twinning risk, but I will defer to the ball chem experts on that one specifically. To zoom out a little bit, one of the reasons why we would typically see more twins in older cows. Again, it's kind of a long physiology story, but the short version of it is that one of the risk factors for double ovulation, which is what leads to twins, is that the follicles in that last follicular wave before insemination are growing up under a lower progesterone environment, and that allows two follicles to be dominant, and so the cow double ovulates instead of single ovulates as she ought to. And cows with a higher metabolic rate, which on average means higher producing cows and or older cows, that's one of the reasons why you may well see, often would see, more twins in older animals.
All right. Ryan is asking, when I hear extended lactations, I think fat, dry cows. Have these studies followed up on the subsequent lactation health and performance of extended lactation cows?
Some of them have. Again, there are not many of them. They are tough studies to do. So kudos to those researchers who have pulled that off. Yes, some of them have. My caveats would be that these are studies with tens or at most hundreds of cows, which means they're not necessarily powered for looking at future health or disease risks, big picture fertility outcomes, and so on. And they were done in somewhat different management and nutrition circumstances to what might be typical in the United States or Canada. So I think my point is that there's several grains of salt we need to take there. I don't think it's not impossible, hypothetically, that we could manage cows if it truly were desirable to have extended lactations. That could be manageable through different grouping and feeding strategies. I think I've made it clear by now that I would certainly worry about whether that is economically optimal, but I don't think it's impossible.
All right. Carrie's asking, doesn't it reduce the carbon footprint of a dairy if we keep cows longer and have fewer replacements?
Depends. And so no, to be serious, it depends is how you're measuring that, because if you're looking at the carbon footprint per cow, then the argument, and this even became almost national policy in Denmark, for example, was on that premise. We'll keep cows around longer, therefore we'll need fewer replacements, therefore there will be fewer total cattle in the country, with mouths to belch methane, and therefore that will reduce methane. I think the part that's at least very debatable is if we were to look at a slightly different denominator, like how much methane per pound or kilogram of milk produced, how much per unit of human food produced, I think that very likely changes that equation considerably. And so that's where I think we need to be careful about what exactly we're talking about and what the calculation is.
All right. One last question, then we'll let you go, Dr. LeBlanc. But next one is, what other metrics do we need to consider when determining whether we have a healthy culling rate, maybe heifers versus cows, PTAs?
Again, those culling decisions really, ideally, are made at the individual animal level. And so I guess I would just underline that the take home is there is no one optimal culling rate. Economists have tried to put reasonable assumptions into models and try to answer that question of, given a bunch of what seem to be reasonable assumptions, what might be a reasonable ballpark, and they often come up with numbers that are in the magnitude of a 30% annual herd turnover. But I really, really caution that is not a take home and just apply it. It's really a cow level decision. And again, it's complicated. And so one dairy this year, their best culling rate may turn out to be 25%. Another, because they're trying to grow or whatever. There are a lot of variables. The same dairy next year, their optimal culling rate might be 10 percentage points different. And the neighbor would be different again, because they've just got different inputs into there. So I think the take home is there is no one optimal culling rate. That should not be an end or a target in itself.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. LeBlanc, and thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. If you have additional questions, please submit them to anh.marketing@balchem.com. We're excited to announce a new webinar series called the Real Producer Exchange, designed to explore the real-world decisions shaping today's dairy operations. In our first episode, we're excited to welcome Claire Alderink, manager of Rise Bowl Dairy in Bailey, Michigan. That's a 3,000 cow operation at the forefront of innovation. Claire has been hands-on in testing some of the industry's leading and latest technologies. We take a deep dive into how his tracking results, adapting to real time and making data-driven decisions that improve both productivity and profitability. Scan the QR code on the screen to register. The Real Science Lecture Series continues with educational topic each and every month, including the next one on June 3rd with Got More Milk? The latest research on fueling dairy cows with high oleic soybeans, featuring Dr. Adam Locke from Michigan State University. Visit balchem.com/real science for details on future webinars and to register for upcoming events. Balchem's podcast series, The Real Science Exchange, continues to offer a deeper dive into our webinar topics. Log on to your favorite podcast platform and just simply search for Real Science Exchange, or visit balchem.com/podcast. And if you want a really cool Real Science Exchange t-shirt, just subscribe to the Real Science Exchange. Send us a screenshot along with your address to anh.marketing@balchem.com. We'll get that off to you right away. And on behalf of Balchem and Dr. LeBlanc, thank you for joining us today.